when we talk about avoidant attachment, we often make a mistake. We assume these individuals don't care, that they don't feel deeply, that they are disconnected from emotional needs altogether. That's not accurate. Avoidant individuals don't lack emotional intensity, they lack tolerance for emotional intensity in real time with another person. Internally, their system is often active, alert, and sensitive. But externally, they've learned to shut down emotional expression as a form of control. Now here's where it gets interesting. When an avoidant encounters someone who is emotionally steady, not chasing, not collapsing, not overreacting, their nervous system registers something unusual. Predictability without pressure. That predictability becomes important. Because in their internal world, emotional experiences often feel inconsistent. They associate closeness with loss of autonomy. So they create distance to regain control. But distance has a cost. It removes emotional stimulation, elation. And this is where the addiction pattern begins, not addiction in a romantic sense, but in a neurobehavioral sense. The avoidant starts to track the person who provides emotional stability at a distance, not because they want closeness, but because that person becomes a reference point of regulation. Your energy, meaning your emotional tone, your consistency, your lack of volatility, becomes something their system starts to recognize as safe. Even when they pull away, their attention doesn't fully detach. This creates a push-pull dynamic. They move away to regain independence, but they mentally monitor whether your emotional presence remains stable. If you react strongly, chase, or collapse, their system confirms closeness equals pressure, and they retreat further. But if you remain grounded, something different happens. Their nervous system begins to associate you with safe activation, emotional engagement without overwhelm. This is where confusion often appears. RS. They may disappear, then reappear. They may act distant, then suddenly attentive. This is not manipulation in most cases, it is regulation-seeking behavior. They return not because they have resolved their fear of intimacy, but because your emotional presence has become a stabilizing anchor in their internal environment. The key misunderstanding is this. You are not making them addicted in a controlling sense. You are becoming part of their emotional regulation loop. However, there is a boundary most people miss. If your energy becomes inconsistent, if you start overchasing, overgiving, or overreacting, the avoidance system loses the reference point it was tracking, and the cycle breaks or becomes more chaotic. On the other hand, if your emotional state is too detached, too unavailable, the system loses stimulation entirely and disengages. So what holds the loop together is not intensity, it is regulated consistency. This is why some avoidants seem drawn back repeatedly. They are not chasing love in the conventional sense. They are returning to a nervous system pattern that feels familiar, predictable, and low threat. And familiarity in human behavior is powerful, even more powerful than desire. Avoidant individuals are often misunderstood because their outward behavior appears distant, detached, or emotionally unavailable. From the outside, it can look like they simply do not feel much, or that they lack depth in emotional experience. But this interpretation misses a critical psychological reality. Avoidants are not emotionally empty. In fact, many of them are experiencing the opposite state internally. Their emotional system is often highly active, but it is processed in a contained, controlled, and heavily filtered way. Inside their mind, emotional experiences are not absent, they are intensified and compressed. Feelings arise quickly, sometimes strongly, but instead of being expressed outwardly, they are redirected inward. Over time, this creates a kind of internal overload. The emotions do not disappear, they accumulate, stack, and are managed privately through suppression, intellectualization, or emotional distancing. What you see externally is not the absence of emotion, but the result of a long-standing strategy to regulate emotional intensity by minimizing outward expression. This pattern often develops early in life, when emotional expression was met with inconsistency, rejection, or overwhelm. The nervous system learns a protective strategy: reduce visibility of emotional states. The goal is not to eliminate feelings, but to avoid the consequences of expressing them. So the avoidant adapts by becoming self-contained. They learn to process emotions alone, without relying on others for regulation. This creates a dual structure: intense internal experience and minimal external display. Because of this, avoidance can appear calm even when internally activated. They may feel anxiety, attachment, longing, or otherwise, and emotional dependency, but their outward behavior remains restrained. This mismatch between internal state and external expression is what confuses people in relationships. Others often assume nothing is happening inside because nothing is being shown. In reality, a lot is happening, it is simply being managed behind a controlled emotional barrier. Another important layer is that avoidants often become highly sensitive to emotional intensity in others because it mirrors what they suppress in themselves. When someone expresses strong emotional need or vulnerability, it can activate discomfort, not because they do not understand it, but because it resonates with their own internal pressure system. To maintain control, they increase distance, not to reject emotion itself, but to reduce internal overload triggered by external emotional demand. This is why their behavior can seem inconsistent. They are not disconnected from emotion, they are selectively disconnected from expression. They experience deeply but reveal minimally. And over time, this creates a habit of emotional self-regulation that depends heavily on distance, space, and internal processing rather than relational exchange. In relationships, this dynamic can create a powerful illusion. The avoidant may appear unaffected, yet internally they are tracking, analyzing, and processing far more than they show. Their silence is not emptiness, it is containment. Their withdrawal is not absence of feeling, it is an attempt to manage intensity without becoming overwhelmed by it. Understanding this distinction changes how their behavior is interpreted. It shifts the perspective from "they don't feel" to "they feel too much to express safely." And that difference is essential for accurately understanding avoidant attachment patterns without reducing them to emotional absence. Avoidant individuals manage relationships through a paradox that often confuses the people around them. On the surface, it looks like you are pulling away from closeness entirely, as if intimacy itself is unwanted. But underneath that behavior is a more complex regulation system. They do not reject emotional experience itself, they regulate it. And the primary tool they use for that regulation is distance. For an avoidant, closeness is not simply a positive emotional state. It is an intensity state. When emotional proximity increases, so does internal activation. That activation can feel overwhelming, unpredictable, or difficult to control. So instead of moving toward connection to stabilize it, they instinctively create space. Distance becomes a way to reduce emotional load, slow down internal arousal, and regain a sense of control over their own system. But distance has an unintended consequence. While it reduces emotional pressure, it also reduces emotional stimulation. Human nervous systems are built to respond to engagement, feedback, and relational signals. When those signals decrease, something else happens. Emotional flatness begins to emerge. For avoidant individuals, this can create a quiet but persistent internal shift. They are no longer overwhelmed, but they are also no longer emotionally activated in a meaningful way. This is where the contradiction begins. They regulate closeness through distance, but once distance is established, they begin to miss the very emotional stimulation that closeness provided. Not necessarily the intensity or the vulnerability itself, but the aliveness that comes from emotional interaction. The nervous system, even in avoidant patterns, still seeks engagement. It still responds to interest, attention, curiosity, and emotional exchange. These inputs create a sense of psychological signal, something to process, analyze, and respond to. So while they consciously move away from connection, another part of their system continues to monitor for emotional stimulation. This is why avoidant behavior often appears cyclical. They withdraw to stabilize themselves. Yes. But in withdrawal, they lose the emotional input that keeps them engaged with others. Eventually, a kind of internal emptiness or low stimulation state develops, which pulls them back toward interaction again. However, when they return, they do not always re-enter in a fully open or vulnerable way. Instead, they often seek controlled stimulation. They want interaction, but on terms that do not recreate the same level of internal overwhelm that caused them to withdraw in the first place. This creates a push-pull rhythm where they move between distance for regulation and proximity for stimulation. It is important to understand that this is not a conscious strategy. It is a learned regulation pattern. The avoidant system is trying to balance two competing needs: safety through distance and stimulation through connection. Too much closeness feels like loss of control. Too much distance feels like emotional disengagement. so they oscillate between both states, trying to find equilibrium. From the outside, this can look inconsistent or confusing. At times they appear detached, and at other times unexpectedly engaged. But internally the pattern is consistent. They are constantly adjusting their emotional environment to manage intensity levels. Distance lowers pressure. Connection restores stimulation. Neither state is fully satisfying on its own, which is why the cycle repeats. Even when they are distant, emotional stimulation does not fully disappear from their awareness. They may think about the other person, observe from afar, or re-engage mentally with the relationship without fully participating in it. This allows them to maintain a low level of emotional input without risking full exposure to closeness. In this way, avoidant attachment is not a rejection of connection itself. It is a system of regulating how much connection can be tolerated at any given time. Distance is used as a stabilizer, but stimulation remains necessary for emotional vitality. The tens. Ion between these two needs is what shapes their relational behavior over time. When someone has an avoidant attachment pattern, their internal emotional world is often not as steady as their external presentation suggests. Outwardly, they may appear calm, controlled, and self-sufficient, but internally, there can be fluctuations in emotional intensity, threat perception, and relational uncertainty. What makes this even more complex is that they rarely rely on others to regulate that internal state in a direct or openly dependent way. Instead, they depend on indirect cues, patterns, and observations. One of the most powerful of those cues is emotional consistency in another person. When your emotional responses remain steady over time, something important happens in their perception system. You begin to form a predictable pattern. You are not shifting between extremes of approval and withdrawal, not oscillating between emotional intensity and emotional absence. Instead, you remain relatively, generally stable in how you respond, how you communicate, and how you carry your emotional tone. This stability becomes more than just a personality trait to them. It becomes a reference point. In an avoidant individual's internal experience, relationships are often associated with unpredictability. Emotional closeness may have historically come with inconsistency, pressure, or sudden changes in availability. As a result, their nervous system becomes highly attuned to patterns that can be predicted and tracked. Predictability, even more than affection, begins to register as safety. This is where emotional consistency gains significance. Your steady emotional presence acts like a calibration marker. When they interact with you, they are not only engaging in conversation or connection, they are unconsciously measuring how stable the environment feels. If your responses remain grounded and proportional, their system has something to orient around. It reduces the need for hypervigilance because the emotional weather of the interaction does not change unpredictably. This does not mean they immediately become open or emotionally expressive. Instead, it creates a subtle form of trust at the nervous system level. Trust here is not based on verbal reassurance or explicit commitment. It is based on repeated exposure to stable emotional output. Over time, your consistency becomes familiar, and familiarity is one of the strongest regulators of anxiety in avoidant attachment patterns. What makes this even more influential is that avoidant individuals often struggle with internal emotional regulation during relational proximity. When closeness increases, internal activation can rise. But if the emotional environment remains steady rather than reactive, it prevents escalation. Your consistency acts as a buffer. It reduces emotional spikes that would otherwise trigger withdrawal. At the same time, consistency also creates contrast. If their internal world feels variable, uncertain, tame, or difficult to interpret, your stable emotional tone stands out even more. This contrast makes you easier to track mentally. You become a known quantity in a system that is often trying to predict outcomes to maintain control. Over time, this can lead to a subtle form of dependence that is not openly acknowledged. Not dependence in the emotional reliance sense, but in the regulatory sense. Your presence becomes something their system checks against when assessing emotional stability in relationships. When you are present, things feel more organized. When you are absent, that reference point is missing, and internal uncertainty can increase. However, it is important to understand that this does not automatically translate into emotional openness from them. Avoidance systems do not always convert safety into vulnerability in a linear way. Instead, safety can sometimes increase observation rather than expression. They may engage more, but still within controlled limits. Still though, core effect remains. Your emotional consistency reduces perceived unpredictability. And in an avoidant framework, reducing unpredictability is one of the most powerful forms of relational influence. Because in a world where emotional intensity is often managed through distance and control, a stable emotional reference point becomes something the system quietly returns to again and again for orientation. Avoidant attachment patterns often create a relational dynamic that appears contradictory on the surface, but is internally consistent when understood through the lens of emotional regulation. One of the most defining patterns is what can be described as a push-pull loop. This is where the individual simultaneously resists closeness while remaining psychologically engaged with the emotional presence of the other person. They step back from intimacy, yet they do not fully disconnect from it internally. The push aspect of this loop is driven by the need for autonomy and emotional control. When intimacy increases, the avoidance system often interprets this as rising emotional demand. That demand does not have to be explicit, it can be subtle, such as expectations of emotional availability, responsiveness, or mutual vulnerability. As these signals accumulate, internal activation increases. To reduce that activation, the system creates distance. This distancing can take many forms: reduced communication, emotional withdrawal, delayed responses, or a shift toward detachment in tone. On the surface, this looks like rejection of intimacy, but it is more accurately a regulatory response to intensity. The system is not rejecting connection itself, it is reducing exposure to emotional load. This is the push away from closeness, designed to restore internal balance and reduce perceived pressure. However, the loop does not end there. Once distance is created, a different psychological process begins. The emotional intensity decreases, but so does stimulation and relation. Engagement. Human attachment systems are not designed for complete disconnection. Even avoidance systems continue to monitor relational environments at a subconscious level. This is where the pull begins to emerge. While physically or emotionally distant, the avoidant individual often remains attentive to the emotional state of the other person. They track changes in tone, availability, responsiveness, and emotional energy. Not necessarily through direct interaction, but through subtle cues, patterns, or intermittent engagement. This tracking is not always conscious. It operates more like background monitoring, where the nervous system continues to scan for signals of safety, threat, or stability. If your emotional energy remains consistent during their distance, it creates a sense of predictability. If your emotional state shifts dramatically, it creates uncertainty. Either way, your emotional presence continues to register in their system even when they are not actively engaging. This ongoing internal tracking is what forms the pull component of the loop. The pull is not always expressed as immediate reconnection. It can manifest as curiosity, checking in, indirect contact, or mental preoccupation with the relationship. The avoidance system is essentially trying to resolve a tension. Distance provides relief from intensity, but it also removes relational stimulation and emotional grounding. As a result, the system oscillates between needing space and needing contact. This is why avoidant behavior can appear inconsistent to others. They may withdraw when closeness increases, then reappear when distance becomes too emotionally quiet. The timing of this cycle is not random. It is driven by internal thresholds of activation and disengagement. When emotional intensity crosses a certain threshold, they push away. When emotional absence becomes too pronounced, they are pulled back in. Importantly, tracking your emotional energy does not necessarily mean they are consciously evaluating your feelings in a deliberate way. Instead, they are often responding to the felt sense of your presence in their internal representation of the relationship. Your emotional tone becomes a reference point they compare against their internal state. If your energy feels stable, it can be regulating. If it feels unpredictable, it can intensify the need for distance. Over time, this push-pull loop can become a self-reinforcing cycle. Each time they move away, they reduce immediate emotional pressure but maintain psychological connection through monitoring. Each time they move closer, they restore emotional stimulation but risk reactivating the need for distance. The system never fully resolves because both distance and connection serve different regulatory functions. In essence, avoidants are not fully disengaging from intimacy, nor are they fully embracing it. They are continuously adjusting proximity to manage internal emotional load while still remaining linked to the emotional field of the other person. The result is a dynamic pattern where rejection of closeness and tracking of emotional energy coexist within the same relational system. What people often describe as addiction in avoidant relationships is usually misunderstood. It can look like obsession, emotional dependency, or a compulsive return to a specific person's presence. But when you examine it through a psychological and nervous system lens, it is not addiction in the emotional or conscious sense. It is familiarity. More precisely, it is the nervous system recognizing a pattern it knows how to process. The human nervous system is constantly scanning for cues of safety and predictability. It does not evaluate relationships purely through logic or conscious preference. Instead, it learns through repetition, emotional exposure, and physiological response. Over time, it begins to associate certain emotional environments with specific internal states. When those environments are re-encountered, the body reacts before the conscious mind fully interprets what is happening. In avoidant attachment patterns, relationships are often managed through cycles of activation and withdrawal. There is closeness, then distance. Engagement, then emotional retreat. This creates a patterned rhythm. Even if the avoidant individual pulls away, their system retains a kind of imprint of the emotional experience that was present during interaction. That imprint includes tone, intensity, responsiveness, and emotional predictability. When they return to that same emotional environment, even after time or distance, something familiar is activated internally. The nervous system recognizes the pattern before reasoning begins. This recognition can feel compelling, not because of emotional dependency in a conscious sense, but because the system is responding to a known regulatory pathway. Familiarity reduces uncertainty, and reduction of uncertainty is one of the strongest drivers of human attention and return behavior. This is why it can appear as if they are drawn back to certain individuals. It is not necessarily that they are consciously longing for the person in a romantic or emotional way. It is that the emotional pattern associated with that person has been encoded as something the nervous system knows how to navigate. Even if the experience includes intensity or discomfort, familiarity still provides a form of predictability. In avoidant individuals, this becomes even more complex. Because they often regulate emotional intensity through distance, the emotional environment of a specific person can become associated with both activation and relief. When they are engaged, there is emotional stimulation. When they withdraw, there is emotional reduction. This pairing creates a strong internal mapping between that person and a complete emotional cycle. As a result, when they experience similar emotional cues elsewhere, or when they feel internal balance, the nervous system may reference that familiar pattern as a form of regulation memory. The pullback is not always desire. It is often the system returning to a known structure that previously helped it stabilize or orient itself emotionally. This is also why the behavior can feel inconsistent or confusing from the outside. What looks like repeated emotional pursuit is not always driven by intentional attachment. It is often a pattern of returning to something the system has already learned how to process. Even if the conscious mind resists or minimizes the importance of the connection, the nervous system still responds to familiarity. Another key aspect is that familiarity does not require positive association. The nervous system does not only return to what feels good, it returns to what feels known. Known emotional patterns reduce cognitive load. They reduce the need for constant adaptation. In contrast, unfamiliar emotional environments require more processing, more uncertainty management, and more internal regulation effort. So what appears as addiction is actually the repetition of a learned emotional map. The system is not chasing pleasure in a simple sense. It is moving toward predictability, even if that predictability includes complexity, intensity, or mixed emotional signals. In avoidant attachment, where emotional regulation is already tightly controlled through distance and internal processing, familiar relational patterns can become especially salient. They offer a known emotional rhythm that the system can anticipate. And in human behavior, what is predictable often feels safer than what is purely comfortable. Ultimately, what is being mistaken for addiction is not a loss of control or emotional dependence at a conscious level. It is the nervous system returning to a familiar regulatory pattern that has been encoded through repetition, emotional experience, and relational rhythm. When your emotional control remains steady in the present sea of someone with avoidant tendencies, something subtle but powerful begins to form in their perception system. It is not immediate attraction or conscious attachment. It is a gradual recognition that your emotional state does not destabilize under pressure. In relationships where emotional intensity often leads to withdrawal, this kind of stability becomes highly noticeable at a subconscious level. Avoidant individuals are often managing internal fluctuations that they do not openly express. Their system is sensitive to emotional escalation, unpredictability, and perceived loss of control within relationships. Because of this, they tend to monitor the emotional environment more than they engage with it directly. They are not just interacting with you, they are also continuously assessing how the interaction feels internally. When your emotional responses remain measured, grounded, and consistent, it creates a very specific effect in that assessment process. You begin to function as a reference point, not in a symbolic or idealized way, but in a regulatory sense. Your emotional presence becomes something their nervous system can compare against internal states of activation. When they feel overwhelmed, uncertain, or emotionally activated, the memory or perception of your stability becomes part of their internal recalibration process. It is not always conscious. In most cases, it operates beneath awareness. The stronger your emotional control, the less you contribute to emotional escalation within the interaction. This reduces the perceived threat level of closeness. For an avoidant system, closeness is not inherently negative, but it is often associated with intensity that feels difficult to regulate. When that intensity is not amplified by the other person, the system begins to categorize the interaction differently. It shifts from high activation to manageable engagement. Over time, this creates a kind of internal mapping. Your emotional consistency becomes ease encoded as a predictable pattern. Predictability in attachment systems is not just comfort, it is orientation. It allows the nervous system to reduce uncertainty about what will happen next emotionally. And when uncertainty decreases, the need for defensive withdrawal also decreases. This is where the idea of a regulation anchor becomes relevant. You are not actively regulating them, and you are not controlling their emotional state. Instead, your emotional behavior provides a stable external reference that their system can use when internally dysregulated. When they move into states of emotional activation or withdrawal, the memory of your steadiness can act as a counterbalance in their internal processing. However, this does not always translate into obvious closeness or emotional openness. In many cases, avoidant individuals do not move directly from feeling safe to expressing vulnerability. Instead, safety often leads to increased observation. They may engage in subtle ways, reappear intermittently, or maintain a quiet awareness of your presence without fully entering emotional dependence. The system is still testing, still measuring, still confirming consistency over time. Your emotional control also changes the quality of their internal experience during interaction. Instead of encountering emotional unpredictability, they encounter emotional steadiness. This reduces the cognitive and emotional effort required to manage the interaction. Less effort means less perceived threat, which can reduce the instinct to withdraw as quickly or as strongly as they might in more emotionally reactive dynamics. At the same time, this stability creates contrast. If their internal world is fluctuating and your presence is steady, you become more noticeable in their emotional landscape. Not because you are overwhelming, but because you are consistent. The nervous system naturally pays attention to patterns that remain stable over time, especially when other inputs feed, the less predictable. This is also why such individuals may seem to return without clear explanation. It is not always an intentional decision based on emotional longing. It is often a pattern of returning to what provides internal orientation. When emotional regulation becomes necessary, the system may reference the most stable emotional environment it has previously experienced. In this way, emotional control does not create pursuit in a direct sense, but it creates recognition. And recognition in the nervous system is powerful. It forms the basis of familiarity, predictability, and reduced threat response. Over time, this can make your emotional presence a quiet but persistent anchor point that their system revisits when internal balance is disrupted.